1. Cotard Syndrome. I am dead, yet I still breathe. Cotard Syndrome was first described in 1880 by French neurologist Jules Cotard. His patients claimed their organs had disappeared. Their souls had extinguished. One patient said, "I have no blood. I am a living corpse." Modern neuroscientists believe Cotard Syndrome stems from a malfunction between self-recognition and emotional awareness. The brain recognizes the body, but it no longer feels it. Neuroimaging studies suggest reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex and certain areas of the limbic system. This syndrome is classified as a delusional disorder because patients deny the existence of their body or the external world. In extreme cases, patients stop eating or speaking, believing a dead person has no need for nourishment. When the body becomes foreign, the brain invents its own truth. Death. Capgras Syndrome. That is not my husband. Capgras Syndrome was discovered by French psychiatrist Joseph Capgras in 1923. He observed a woman convinced her husband had been replaced by a perfect double. Modern research shows this disorder occurs after lesions to the temporal lobe and limbic system. Specifically, there is a break in the connection between the fusiform gyrus, the brain region that recognizes faces, and the amygdala, which processes emotions. The brain identifies the face, but the emotional connection disappears, leaving a sense of unfamiliarity. Interestingly, it is the neurological opposite of prosopagnosia, where patients cannot consciously recognize a face, yet feel the associated emotion. When memory and emotion separate, reality fractures. Alien hand syndrome. This is not my hand. This phenomenon was first described in 1909 by German neurologist Kurt Goldstein and later deepened by scientist Norman Geschwin. It often manifests after brain surgery, particularly when the corpus callosum, the bridge between the two hemispheres, is severed. The syndrome results from a desynchronization between intention and motor execution. The dominant hemisphere, which controls intention, can no longer inhibit the other hemisphere. The affected hand, often the left, acts with purpose but involuntarily. In famous clinical cases, patients watched their alien hand attempt to strangle them or tie shoelaces while the other hand untied them, creating a literal conflict within the body. When the two halves of the brain cease to communicate, the body becomes foreign to itself. Stockholm Syndrome. Loving your captor. In 1973, a bank robbery in Stockholm lasted 6 days. When it ended, the hostages refused to testify against their captors. Some even fell in love with them. It was criminologist Niels Bayero who named this phenomenon Stockholm Syndrome. Psychologists see it as a trauma survival mechanism, triggered when the victim perceives a mortal threat, feels isolated, and depends entirely on the aggressor for survival. It is not a formal diagnosis in the DSM-5. The formation of emotional bonding is a way to diminish fear and unconsciously defend against aggression. This phenomenon is more accurately considered a post-traumatic response, not a classical mental illness. To survive, the mind sometimes learns to love its prison.
Jerusalem Syndrome. Becoming a prophet. Every year, visitors arrive in Jerusalem to pray, but some leave convinced they are divine messengers. This disorder was observed and documented starting in the 1980s by psychiatrists Yair Bar-El and Eliezer Witztum at Kfar Shal Hospital in Israel. Patients develop religious hallucinations. They hear voices. They preach in the streets. They identify themselves as biblical figures: Moses, Mary, Jesus. The syndrome is generally an acute, temporary psychosis affecting mostly individuals without severe prior psychiatric history. The Israeli psychiatrists identified a characteristic symptom triad: the need to isolate for purification, the adoption of a robe, often a hospital sheet, and the delivery of incoherent public sermons. When faith exceeds the limits of reality, faith becomes madness. Paris Syndrome. Beauty that destroys. Paris, the city of light, symbol of love and Western dreams. But for some, this dream becomes a nightmare. Paris Syndrome was identified in 1986 by psychiatrist Hiroaki Ota, then attached to the Japanese embassy in France. It primarily affects Japanese tourists due to marked cultural and linguistic differences, intensified by an idealized and often unrealistic image of Paris propagated by Japanese media. Symptoms include acute anxiety, hallucinations, feelings of persecution, and psychosomatic symptoms, dizziness, sweating. It is an extreme example of culture shock. The Japanese embassy even established an emergency service for repatriating the most severe cases. Sometimes the real world is too harsh for those who dreamed of it too hard. Crazy for two. Two minds, one madness. Two people, one shared delusion. A madness that spreads not through blood but through connection. This phenomenon, also called shared psychotic disorder or induced delusional disorder, was first described in 1877 by French psychiatrists Charles Lazègue and Jean-Pierre Falray. Modern psychology explains this through mental synchronization separation between two emotionally dependent individuals, often isolated. The delusion is initially developed by the dominant person, the primary, and transmitted to the suggestible person, the secondary. The syndrome is usually reversible for the secondary if physical and emotional separation occurs quickly, proving the delusion is induced rather than spontaneous. Madness sometimes is shared like a confession. Dissociative identity disorder, the invisible selves, multiple identities taking turns without awareness, different personalities, each with its own memories, age, and speech patterns. This disorder, now called dissociative identity disorder, or DID, was popularized by psychiatrist Cornelia Wilbur through the case of Sybil Dorset in the 1970s, but the most famous case remains Billy Milligan, studied by psychologist Daniel Keyes, a man possessing 24 distinct personalities. Researchers believe this fragmentation of self is an extreme and adaptive response to deep, repetitive trauma, often experienced in childhood. Dissociation is a defense mechanism where the child separates unbearable memories into different identities to survive psychologically. Each identity, or alter, possesses its own memories, its own age, its own speech patterns, and may be unaware of the others. When pain becomes unbearable, the mind divides to survive.